True horror stories from police officers. Story 1: The disappearing victim. In 2014, Officer Jenkins of a small-town police department in Kansas responded to a late-night call about a domestic disturbance. When he arrived at the address, the house was dark and eerily quiet. He knocked on the door, and a woman in her 30s answered, looking distressed. She told Officer Jenkins that her husband had been acting violently and was now missing. She led him to the basement, where she said she last saw him. As Jenkins descended the stairs, he felt a cold chill. The basement was cluttered and dimly lit, with an oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, Jenkins heard a faint whisper, "Help me." He turned to see a shadowy figure at the far end of the basement, partially obscured by debris. The woman screamed, and the figure vanished. Jenkins searched the basement thoroughly but found no trace of the man. The woman insisted her husband had been right there, but he was never found. Subsequent investigations revealed the house had a history of violence and disappearances dating back decades. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something supernatural that night, and the case remains unsolved. Story 2: The Phantom Officer. In 2010, Officer Martinez was patrolling a quiet neighborhood in Texas when he received a call about a suspicious figure seen near an abandoned building. He arrived at the scene and entered the building cautiously. As he moved through the dark, empty halls, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. Turning, he saw another officer standing at the end of the corridor. The officer was dressed in an old police uniform and had a stern expression. Martinez called out, but the officer didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked through a closed door. Martinez rushed to the door and opened it, only to find an empty room. Shaken, Martinez later learned that the building had been the site of a police shootout in the 1970s, where an officer was killed. The description of the phantom officer matched that of the deceased cop. Martinez never saw the ghost again, but he remains convinced that the spirit of the fallen officer still patrols the building, trying to finish his last call. Story 3: The Haunted Highway. In 2016, Officer Thompson was on night duty patrolling a stretch of highway in rural Georgia known for its high number of accidents. Around midnight, he spotted a woman standing on the side of the road, waving frantically. He pulled over and asked if she needed help. The woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, seemed distraught and claimed her car had broken down further up the road. Thompson offered to take her to safety and went to open the passenger door, but when he turned back, she was gone. Confused, Thompson drove up the road and found an old, rusted car in a ditch, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Inside the car, he found a photograph of the woman he had just spoken to. A subsequent investigation revealed that she had died in a car crash at that spot decades earlier. Since then, numerous officers and motorists have reported seeing her ghost, still trying to get help for her broken-down car. Story 4: The Call from the Grave. In 2018, Officer Lee received a distress call from a rural farmhouse in Wisconsin. A woman was screaming for help, saying her husband was trying to kill her. Lee and his partner rushed to the address but found the house dark and seemingly abandoned. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Breaking in, they found the interior covered in dust, with no signs of recent habitation. As they searched the house, Lee found an old, rotary phone off the hook in the kitchen. It was the source of the call, yet there was no one there. Lee later discovered that the house had been empty for years after a tragic murder-suicide involving the previous owners. The woman's screams for help had been heard by neighbors and police multiple times over the years, but no one could explain how the calls were still being made. The phone line had been disconnected years ago. Story 5: The Shadow in the Cell. In 2019, Officer Rodriguez was working the night shift at a city jail in California. One of the cells was known among the officers for its eerie atmosphere. Inmates often complained of feeling watched and hearing whispers in the dark. That night, an inmate started screaming, claiming someone was in his cell. Rodriguez and his partner rushed to the cell, finding the inmate cowering in the corner. He insisted that a shadowy figure had been standing over his bed. Rodriguez searched the cell but found no one. The inmate was moved to another cell, and Rodriguez decided to review the security footage. What he saw chilled him to the bone. The footage showed a dark, indistinct figure materializing in the cell, standing over the inmate before vanishing into thin air. Rodriguez couldn't explain the footage, and the cell was left empty for months. The cell had a grim history. It had been the site of several suicides over the years. Officers now avoid the cell as much as possible, and it remains a constant reminder of the unexplainable occurrences that sometimes happen in their line of work. Story 6: The Abandoned Asylum. In 2017, Officer Carson and his partner were called to investigate reports of strange noises coming from an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of their small town in Pennsylvania. The asylum had been closed for decades and was notorious for its dark history and rumored hauntings. Locals often dared each other to spend the night there, but no one ever lasted long. Carson and his partner arrived at the crumbling building just after midnight. The moonlight cast eerie shadows through the broken windows, and the air was thick with an unsettling silence. As they entered the asylum, the smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. Their flashlights flickered, casting long, wavering beams of light through the dark hallways. As they moved deeper into the building, they began to hear faint whispers and the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. They called out, but there was no response. They decided to split up, each taking a different wing of the asylum. Carson carefully navigated the narrow, debris-strewn corridors, his heart pounding. He entered what appeared to be an old patient room, its walls covered in faded graffiti and peeling paint. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, when he heard a soft, childlike giggle behind him. Spinning around, he saw a small figure standing in the doorway, a young girl in a tattered hospital gown, her eyes wide and unblinking. She whispered, "Help me," and then vanished into thin air. Carson felt a cold chill run down his spine. He tried to radio his partner, but the static was the only response. Desperate to find his partner and leave the asylum, Carson made his way back to the main corridor. As he approached the central hall, he saw his partner standing there, looking pale and shaken. His partner had experienced something similar, hearing voices and seeing shadowy figures moving through the rooms. They decided to leave immediately and reported their experiences to their superiors. The asylum was sealed off, and no one was allowed inside again. Carson and his partner couldn't explain what they had seen, but the memory of that night stayed with them. They had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, a lingering presence that haunted the abandoned asylum, trapped in its tragic past.